This happened to us 2 years ago, but I swear, if you've ever had your personal space violated like this, that cold, gut-wrenching feeling stays etched in your mind like it was yesterday. It was me, my daughter, and her father, living in a shared house, in what you'd definitely call the hood. We always told ourselves, we have nothing of major value, so we're safe. What a joke that turned out to be. This entire nightmare stretched out over the course of a month, and it all started on a perfectly nice day. We decided to take a quick walk to the corner store. It was close, and the weather was great. A simple, harmless decision. We were gone for less than 20 minutes. But when we got back, a chill ran right down my spine the moment I saw the front door. Our lock, the one thing that was supposed to keep us safe, had been viciously attacked. There were obvious dents and deep gouges in the metal, fresh blue pry marks I couldn't explain, and a massive boot print stamped right below the handle. Someone had wanted in. Bad. And it wasn't just the front. The back door had the exact same telltale signs that I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why? We had nothing worth the risk. No big cash, no high-end electronics. This felt personal, not professional. And the fact that we were only gone for 20 minutes meant that whoever it was could still be close, maybe watching from the alley, maybe waiting to see us clean up their mess. The tension was suffocating. It felt like an invisible tripwire had just been snapped. From that day on, everything went sideways and bizarre. If I tried to describe every single tiny, unsettling detail, I'd be typing for days. So let me just give you the highlights. You have to understand, these things just kept piling up, eating away at my sanity. I kept finding things out of place, things I knew, absolutely knew. I hadn't moved. The TV remote control. In the bathroom, my car keys, slipped under a couch cushion. It created this persistent doubt, this looping question in my head. Am I going crazy, or was someone just here? Then I finally checked my old, ancient windows. I should have done it sooner. The locks on those rusty old frames were busted. A major security breach that I had somehow missed. Next, my dish liquid bottle was inexplicably broken on the sink. But the most horrifying thing was this weird, oily substance that started appearing on random items. It was on my curling iron in the bathroom, and most sickeningly, it was smeared on my 2-year-old daughter's toys. It was like someone was deliberately trying to mark their territory, or perform some kind of sick ritual. Seeing that suspicious fluid coating my daughter's things pushed my fear beyond simple anxiety. It ignited the primal fury of a mother. This wasn't theft. This was personal harassment. A cold-blooded violation of our sanctuary. The mounting dread had been suffocating me for weeks. I was seriously starting to doubt myself. Was I becoming paranoid? Were these signs just the house falling apart? Or was I simply exhausted? Then came the day I took the trash out to the dumpster in the alley. As I lifted the lid on our bin, my eyes locked onto something alien inside, a makeshift tool. It was a short metal rod with a washcloth tightly wrapped around one end, and over that, a blue doctor-type glove. My blood ran cold. The recognition was instant. This was the crude instrument someone had used to pry our locks. And this was the origin of those awful blue markings. A wave of nausea and incandescent rage hit me simultaneously. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. My mind started racing. What else could be out here in the trash, just on a dark impulse? I looked over at my neighbor's dumpster. What I found in that bag made my heart completely drop out of my chest. It was my stuff, not valuables, mind you, but the most random, personal, and unsettling assortment of things. My title to my old car, which had been tucked away in a duffel bag on the top shelf of my closet. Some of my clothes, makeup, and random household items. This wasn't just theft. This was a calculated violation. They hadn't broken in for money. They had breached my private space, rummaged through my life, and then casually tossed the fragments of my existence out with their trash. At that exact moment, the woman next door spotted me discovering the evidence. She immediately turned and started screaming and arguing with the man who lived there. She hurried across the street and vanished. He, however, stepped into his doorway, standing there shirtless, a big, diet, white redneck guy, and fixed me with the most bone-chilling death stare I had ever seen. I was simultaneously livid and terrified. The icy realization slammed into me. These people, my neighbors, had been coming into my house. I looked straight at him, my voice shaking with fury, and said, "I know you guys have been coming into my house." His response? He just smirked, a chilling, dismissive smirk, and challenged me. I didn't steal anything. That smirk, that line, felt like a physical punch. He wasn't denying the break-in. He was denying the theft, implying the invasion was for some other, far more sinister purpose. I completely lost it. The words slipped right out of my mouth, driven by pure instinct and adrenaline. "I'm going to burn your house down." My mind was a blur, putting all the pieces together. The broken dish liquid bottle sitting right below the kitchen window. The busted window lock. They'd been climbing in through there. They had been walking around inside our house multiple times, while my 2-year-old daughter was asleep in the next room. And now he knew I knew. And he was smiling about it. I immediately cut the chase. I called the cops. They eventually showed up, talked to the neighbors for a few minutes, and then, completely uselessly, they left. That was the extent of the law's protection. The second the police car pulled away, the tension didn't just linger. It skyrocketed. It wasn't 5 minutes later that I saw him, that horrible neighbor, come out by my back door. He was on his phone, and he had the biggest, most infuriating smirk plastered across his face. That wasn't the look of a man relieved to be cleared. It was the chilling grin of triumph and pure malice. He knew the police wouldn't touch him. He knew he'd gotten away with it, and he was definitely calling in reinforcements. The feeling of betrayal and utter helplessness was crushing. But what happened next was exponentially worse. Barely 10 minutes after his phone call, a motorcade of menace rolled up. About 5 cars full of people, and then a huge pickup truck, a classic American heavy-duty rig, pulled right up and boxed in our own truck, completely blocking our escape route. Our tiny house was suddenly under siege. A large white guy, tank top on, gold chains around his neck, stepped out of the truck. What made my blood turn to ice was the distinct, cold gleam of metal in his hand. He had a gun. This wasn't a petty neighborhood dispute or a simple break-in anymore. This was a lightning-fast, orchestrated revenge attack, summoned with a single phone call the moment the cops left. My mind went into an overdrive of pure terror. Everything happened in the blink of an eye, like a scene ripped straight out of a horror movie. I instinctively shoved a heavy chair against the back door. A pointless gesture, but it was all I could do, and watched as this mob started making their way toward it. "Honey, get up!" I screamed for my boyfriend. I snatched up my daughter, my 2-year-old, hugging her tightly to my chest, and we bolted for the front door as fast as humanly possible. At the same time, I could hear heavy footsteps pounding as more people came charging around the side of the house, trying to cut us off. I was barely off my porch steps when I heard it, a loud, sharp pop. The sound, crisp and absolutely chilling, tore through the neighborhood silence. They had shot. There was no thought left in my head, only the raw, frantic need to run. I knew I was about to get shot, I knew we were about to be gunned down right there on the street. All I could manage was a desperate, primal yell. Please, no. And we just ran. We were sprinting down the street, me holding my daughter. The cruel contrast was overwhelming. I was gripped by the absolute terror of imminent death, while my little girl was cracking up laughing because she thought Mommy was just playing a crazy running game with her. She had no idea what was happening. I was moving faster than I ever thought possible, and somehow, by some sheer miracle, we rounded the corner and didn't die. We had survived the initial ambush. Once we were safe, I called the cops again, my voice shaking as I described the attack and the gunshot. This time, they acted a little more serious, or at least they actually searched. They looked around, but after a thorough sweep, they claimed to find no bullets and no shell casings. That made me question my own mind. Was I just hysterical? Was that pop sound something else entirely, amplified by my panic? Either way, they took statements from me, and chillingly, from the same neighbors who had just tried to shoot us. I knew, absolutely knew, we weren't staying there that night. I asked the officers if they could just hold the line for a minute while I dashed inside to grab some clothes and diapers. I rushed back into the house, my heart pounding, still paralyzed by the sheer terror of what had just happened. I flew into my daughter's room, trying to grab essentials as quickly as I could. And then I saw it. Right there on the floor of her nursery, abandoned, was an empty gallon jug of weed killer. My entire body went numb. I had found the final, terrifying answer. This was the oily substance I had been finding everywhere for a month. On my curling iron, on her toys. It wasn't grease or motor oil. It was a potent, dangerous chemical. But the real horror was the timing. In the small window of time it took for us to run, wait for the police, and come back, they had re-entered the house. They had slipped back in, grabbed that can, and poured the caustic poison all over my clothes, my daughter's clothes, and every single one of her clean diapers. This was no longer a crime of opportunity, or even simple harassment. This was the calculated, monstrous act of someone trying to hurt us, personally and deeply. It was a malicious act of toxicity, a complete and utter breakdown of humanity, targeting the most vulnerable items. Of a 2-year-old child, I grabbed whatever uncontaminated clothes and diapers I could find and fled that house without a second thought. We never went back to live there. Nothing ever came of it. No arrests were made. There were no answers to any of my questions. I gave them the pry tool, the stolen property, the report of the shooting, and the empty can of poison in my child's room. But the system just completely failed. I went back only once more to collect the rest of our belongings and never looked back. It's been 2 years, but I still have nightmares about it. About the neighbor's smirk, about that terrifying gunshot, about the sickening smell of that chemical. There was no closure, no justice, just the lingering, cold fear. And the paralyzing knowledge that the people who tried to hurt me and my daughter are still out there, free. So, picture this. It was back in 2010, and I genuinely thought I'd hit the career jackpot. I was working as a live-in home health aide, and my patient was part of this ridiculously wealthy family. My setup was sweet, a gorgeous condo, rent-free, right on a pristine golf course. It was the kind of quiet, upscale bubble where the biggest drama was usually someone's bad tee shot. We were, without a doubt, the youngest people in the entire complex. I was 27, and my patient, let's call him Jake, was 21. Now, Jake was a nice kid, a genuinely kind soul, but he was carrying a lot of baggage. He had Asperger's, some severe sensory processing disorder, and BPD. On top of all that, He struggled fiercely with substance abuse. He was essentially a grown man who was legally declared incompetent because he had zero street smarts and even less social awareness. The worst part? He consistently refused his prescribed medication, the stuff that actually made him feel balanced. When he was on it, he was fine. Off it, the emotional instability and anxiety made him an easy mark. Honestly, watching him, you felt like you were dealing with a vulnerable 14 or 15-year-old in a 21-year-old's body. He was pathologically lonely, and I think he fell into drugs, meth, coke, MDMA, the whole grim checklist, just to cope with the depression and, more importantly, just to have people pretend to like him. The warning signs were everywhere before I even unpacked. Before I moved in, 6 of his supposed friends came over for an afternoon visit and ended up squatting in the condo for 2 solid weeks. They drained his bank account like a faulty tap, using his money to fund their personal blizzard of narcotics, and left the place absolutely trashed, like a tornado had specifically targeted the living room. Jake never told them to leave. He just wanted the approval. He's doing miles better today, thank God, but back then, he was a flashing neon sign for every opportunistic user in the county. My job, on paper, was super easy. Keep the house clean, keep the fridge stocked, and get him to take his pills. In reality, I quickly realized I was his personal, unpaid bouncer and security detail. My boss, Jake's mother, gave me the lowdown on the one person who posed the biggest threat, Amber. She was our downstairs neighbor's daughter, and she would crash at her dad's place a few days a week to visit her 2 kids, who her dad had custody of, which should tell you everything you need to know. My boss described her as tall, blonde, and rail thin, 37 years old but looking maybe 25, and she was right. Amber had that deceptive, fragile look of someone who was perpetually strung out but still maintained a faded sort of youth. The mother didn't mince words. Amber was a straight-up addict who saw Jake as a walking ATM. The past trauma was severe. Amber once asked to borrow Jake's car for an hour and didn't bring it back for 2 weeks. Oh, and she was the charming individual who introduced Jake to the 6 destructive friends who nearly bankrupted him. The order was absolute. Amber was never to be allowed in the condo. If she so much as stopped by, or if Jake went anywhere near her, I was to call the mother immediately. After the car theft, they'd put a GPS tracking device on Jake's car, and rumor had it, his mom could even remotely kill the engine. My boss made it clear she didn't expect me to tackle anyone. She just wanted me to be her tripwire. But living there, in that quiet, comfortable cage, I knew my job wasn't just to make sure Jake took his meds. It was to stand directly between a truly vulnerable kid and a hungry, grown-up predator living right below us. That knowledge never let me relax. In the weeks leading up to the main incident, I had to deal with Amber more times than I cared to count, and every single encounter just solidified the cold dread I felt about her. These weren't friendly neighborly chats. They were tense standoffs where I was forced to be the immovable object. My job description quickly boiled down to saying no politely, but firmly, no, Amber, you can't come inside the apartment. No, Jake can't drive you to the store. And absolutely no, Jake is not going to a party at your boyfriend's house. I was the guard dog, constantly planted between her desperation and Jake's resources, and she hated me for it. Amber had this really strange, unsettling vibe. She was always spaced out, like she wasn't just tired, she was actively elsewhere. Her speech was slow, almost slurred, and her eyes were constantly wide and glassy, as if she was perpetually on a different plane of existence. I used to wonder if she was just chronically sleep-deprived until she decided to share this bizarre story with me. She claimed she'd been hit by a car while riding her bike, and the part she complained about most was that she was the one who ended up going to jail. I remember staring at her, thinking, how does that even happen? She explained, very slowly, that she'd been under the influence of a large amount of Xanax at the time of the accident. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces snapped into place. That wasn't an off look. It was the heavy, chemical fog of drug dependency. That sedative haze explained the slow movements and the vacant, wide-eyed stare. While she never got physical, the resentment she harbored for me was thick enough to cut with a knife. She'd constantly try to verbally undermine me, throwing out lines like, "Jake is a 21-year-old man. He's his own person. He doesn't need permission," completely ignoring the fact that he was legally incompetent. But the encounters that truly chilled me were the ones in public, in the parking lot or by the mailboxes. She would instantly zero in on Jake, pull him close, and start whispering. It wasn't soft or friendly. It was manipulative, conspiratorial. You didn't need to hear the words to know she was trying to coil her way back into his life, pressuring him for money, drugs, or a ride. Every time I had to physically step in and pull Jake away, the glare she shot me was pure poison. I knew I was blocking her access to survival, and I could feel the tension building, knowing that eventually something had to give. This was not just neighborly friction. This was hostility simmering right beneath the surface of our quiet golf course community. Now, let's get to the night everything went sideways. It was glorious. Jake was out of state with his father, meaning I had the condo all to myself. It was my mini vacation. My best friend was over, and we were totally checked out, sipping on some PBR and fully committed to watching the latest episode of RuPaul's Drag Race. Everything was chill. Then, around 11 p.m., we heard it, a light, tentative knock. I rolled my eyes, went to the peephole, and sure enough, there was Amber. I didn't even hesitate. I just ignored her. 30 seconds later, the knock came again, louder. I watched her through the fisheye lens of the peephole as she waited, clearly frustrated, and then finally walked away. I sat back down, telling my friend, "Don't worry, that was just the crazy neighbor downstairs. She's gone now. 5 minutes. That's all the peace we got." Because then she was back, and this time, the knocking wasn't polite or even impatient. It was a frantic, aggressive pounding. It sounded exactly like a cop trying to get you to open up during a raid. I was instantly, intensely annoyed. I was off the clock. I didn't want to deal with her volatile brand of madness, especially not with company over. So, I ignored it again, retreating back to the couch. But then, the sheer desperation kicked in. The loud pounding stopped, and she switched tactics, alternating between a forced, normal rhythm and a low, ragged voice. "Hello, Jake? Anyone home? I need help. Hello." Silence from me. And that silence seemed to absolutely snap whatever restraint she had left. I suddenly heard the sound that made my heart leap into my throat. The distinct rattle of the doorknob as she tried to force it open. Thank God, I'm a habitual door locker, but this just seemed to send her spiraling. The tentative voice vanished, replaced by a high-pitched, raw scream, followed by a non-stop, frantic, animalistic barrage against the wood. It was less like knocking, and more like something feral was trying to claw its way through the door. My adrenaline shot up. I got up again, fear overriding my anger, and glued my eye back to the peephole. The sight I saw is burned into my memory forever. She looked completely transformed, like a creature of pure rage. Her hair was tangled, plastered to her sweaty forehead, and her face was contorted into a mask of pure fury. But it was her eyes. Her pupils were huge, dilated black holes consuming all the color. A textbook sign she was jacked up on something powerful. She looked crazed, absolutely unhinged. I will never forget that evil, wide-eyed glare looking right back at me through the little glass lens. I finally managed to ask, through the locked door, what she wanted. Her voice was raspy, demanding. She needed to speak to Jake now. He owed her money now, and she needed a ride to her boyfriend's place right now. I told her flatly, "Jake isn't here." Then she had the audacity to ask me to drive her. I shut her down cold. "No, I've been drinking, and I'm going to bed." The sound that followed was a visceral, guttural scream of defeat and rage. She punctuated it with a vicious punch to the door, a sick, heavy thud, and then, finally, silence. She was gone. My friend and I just stood there, breathing heavily, knowing that whatever crisis she was in, we had just made it exponentially worse. The next morning, the terror from the night before felt distant, almost unreal, like a bad hangover dream. My friend and I were just trying to get ready to leave for breakfast, eager to escape the lingering toxicity in the air, when we heard it again. The knock, but this time, it was slow, steady, and utterly authoritative. The genuine, unmistakable policeman's knock. I went to the door and looked through the peephole, fully expecting to see a slightly more subdued, remorseful Amber. Instead, I saw a real cop. I opened the door, and that's when the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. The quiet, pristine parking lot was a chaos of blue and white. There were cop cars everywhere, an ambulance, and this huge, dark van marked crime scene unit. My stomach dropped. I honestly assumed Amber had finally gone too far and overdosed, that the violence had turned inward. The officer asked me if I'd heard anything strange the previous night. I detailed the entire nightmare encounter with Amber, the screaming, the pounding, the crazed look in her eyes. I paused and hesitantly asked the officer if she was okay. He looked back at me with that grave, professional seriousness and delivered the shocking, crushing truth. Amber was in custody for the murder of her father. My mind went completely blank for a second. Murder? Here? Then he asked the question that made the whole scene snap into a terrifying focus. "Does your patient, Jake, own a crossbow? And if so, is it missing?" My voice was barely a whisper as I answered, "Yes, and yes. It's been gone for a few weeks." The casual disappearance of the weapon was suddenly the linchpin of a homicide. The officer instructed me to speak to detectives at the station as soon as I could. I still don't know which came first, the frantic knocking on my door, or the murder of her father. Was I her final, desperate attempt at a ride before she snapped? Or was she already running on pure, terrified adrenaline after the fact? But the detective later filled in the blanks, outlining a brutal theory driven by addiction. Amber, suffering through agonizing heroin withdrawal, was only focused on one thing: getting to her boyfriend for a fix. She tried Jake, and I shut her down. She tried her father, and he must have refused. That refusal likely triggered the fatal argument. Neighbors heard the yelling, but the outcome was medieval and horrifying. She used Jake's stolen crossbow to kill her own father, then grabbed his truck and fled. She didn't get far, only about a mile, before a patrol car pulled her over, initially just on suspicion of drunk driving. But Amber, utterly unraveled, led them on a high-speed chase across 2 counties before she finally lost control and crashed. When the cops finally got to her, the confession was a bizarre, twisted lie. She blurted out that she was speeding because she needed to check on her dad, claiming she thought someone had stabbed him. Why did she think that? She wouldn't say. They sent police to the condo for a welfare check, and that's how they found him. They found him before her own sons would. That was the grim, final truth of the crazy, drug-addicted neighbor who had been screaming outside my door. She murdered her father with my patient's missing crossbow. This story, folks, isn't about a single personal encounter. No, It's about an entire neighborhood terrorized by just one single man. A neighbor whose eccentricity fully transformed into a genuine threat. In our development, he was known for one thing: his lawn. You have to understand, it wasn't just a nice lawn. It was impossibly green, almost ridiculously dense, maintained by a professional landscaping company that he paid very generously. I was used to occasionally hearing him screaming, losing control at those gardeners, long, drawn-out tirades, blaming them for every single misplaced blade of grass. We all knew he was hot-tempered and had high standards, but we told ourselves, he's just the eccentric lawn guy. But then, last summer, the line between eccentric and full-blown crazy was completely erased. It started when he asked a teenage boy in the neighborhood to house-sit while he was on vacation. Initially, it was a simple job: check the house once a day, lock up, water the flowers, easy deal. However, on the day he left, he handed over an instruction letter. Listen, this wasn't a checklist, it was a manifesto of insanity. The boy had to visit the house multiple times a day. He wasn't just watering plants. He had to turn on and off different sets of lights at specific times. An elaborate theatrical production to fool outsiders into thinking someone was home. But that wasn't the worst part. The list read like an inviolable legal code. The boy was strictly forbidden from walking on the lawn under any circumstances. He further insisted that the boy must take off his dirty shoes before stepping onto the concrete sidewalk outside his house. Imagine that. This man was so obsessive, he didn't want dirt touching the concrete. And here is the detail that sent a chill down my spine. The boy was absolutely forbidden from stepping inside the house. Instead, to turn the lights on and off, he had to use a long stick with a loop on the end, reaching it through the door opening to flip the switches. Watering the plants couldn't be done with a hose either, only a tiny watering can. The letter added a clear threat. He would be remotely monitoring the boy, and if he violated any of the rules, he would have photographic proof of the failure. The boy wasn't a house sitter, he was a surveilled servant in a mental laboratory. The boy's parents were horrified. They called the man immediately, stating frankly that they were uncomfortable and canceling the arrangement. They could watch from afar, but they would not let their son perform that bizarre charade. A heated argument erupted over the phone. A few days later, the crazy neighbor returned. It was early in the morning. Instead of unpacking his luggage, he went straight to the parents' house, banging loudly on the door, waking them up, and trying to pick a fight. The incident was so loud that another neighbor, a retired police officer, had to intervene to try and mediate. And this is the moment that made me realize the full extent of his insanity. During the argument, this neighbor declared he would drop the whole issue if they would allow him to spank the boy on his bare bottom. I repeat, a grown man, demanding to spank a teenage boy on his bare bottom. When they refused, he flew into a rage like a wounded animal, screaming and storming off. From that point on, our community had no doubt this lawn-obsessed neighbor was more than just an eccentric. He was a potential danger. This neighbor's madness didn't stop with the bizarre demands about the lawn. It began to spread like a toxic mold and quickly reached the rest of the neighborhood. Soon after that confrontation, one of our neighbors was cornered by the lawn-obsessed man at the grocery store. He said it was a terrifying experience. The neighbor just ranted for a solid half hour, not giving him a chance to interject a single word. It was a manic stream of speech, pouring out like a machine gun. But what he said was chilling. He didn't just complain about life. He started revealing his sick hatred for women, especially his wife. He insisted that his wife shouldn't have friends, then pivoted to ranting about how his wife's sister was so fat that she had broken their toilet seat the last time she visited. Hearing these things, our neighbor felt like he was dealing with an ultimate controller, a man who viewed women as nothing more than property. And that's when we started noticing the weird thing. Where was his wife? She used to be an outgoing, chatty woman who socialized a lot, a real social butterfly. But now, she was completely absent. Occasionally, you would catch a glimpse of her outside watering the flowers, but always when her husband was right there. The sudden disappearance of someone who was once so active made everything incredibly suspicious, almost as if she were locked inside her own home. Winter arrived, and his craziness flared up in a different form. Everyone in the neighborhood received flyers from his landscaping company. Attached was an anonymous note, unsigned but clearly from him, stating that everyone was strictly forbidden from using that company in the area. The note further threatened that non-compliance would result in legal action. This was ridiculous, since we lived in single-family homes with no HOA, homeowners association, to enforce such rules. It was clearly an act of petty terrorism, a blatant attempt to control what his neighbors did. And then, our fear about the wife was brutally confirmed. Someone saw her during the winter. Her arm was bandaged in a sling, and she had a clear bruise around her eye. When the neighbor approached to ask what happened, the husband immediately appeared, not allowing her to speak a word, and hastily explained that she had simply slipped on the ice. Since then, every subtle attempt, even trying to get the church involved or calling the police for a welfare check when he was away, failed. If she was being abused, she adamantly refused all help, perhaps too terrified of the man controlling her life, and his rage quickly turned to the street. He went ballistic because the snowplows were dumping snow onto his perfect lawn. In retaliation, one early morning, he committed a vicious and dangerous act. He scattered nails on the road surface right outside his property, intentionally targeting the incoming snowplow workers. But the peak of the horror occurred with a family who had just moved in and bought a new puppy. The small, gentle dog was always contained in the fenced yard. One night, around midnight, their doorbell rang. When they opened the door, the crazy neighbor was standing at the edge of their property. He looked straight at them, without a greeting, and made a chilling declaration. The first time that dog crosses this line, you won't have that dog anymore. With that, he pulled out a handgun, waved it in the cold air, pointed it straight at the backyard, and said a single word, bang. They immediately called the police. When the police arrived, he vehemently denied everything, saying the gun was only on his waistband and he was just out for a walk. Although he only received a minor citation, the whole neighborhood understood clearly his madness was now armed with lethal force. The threat was no longer about dandelions, it was about survival. After the gun threat, our entire neighborhood lived in a state of high alert. A feeling of powerlessness lingered, as it was clear the police couldn't do much to stop someone who only received a minor citation. When spring returned, this neighbor transitioned to a new harassment tactic, a shift from open violence to chilling surveillance. He began spending hours sitting outside. Every time anyone, from children riding bikes to adults driving home, passed by, he would diligently write something down in a notebook. We couldn't know what he was recording, perhaps curses, or a detailed list of things he disliked about us. But that act of sitting there, staring and taking notes, created a constant atmosphere of fear. You felt like your smallest actions were being recorded and judged by a dangerous enemy. Personally, I changed my driving route home just to avoid passing his section of the street. Everyone did it. We had to change our lives just because of one man's insanity. But then, the final incident occurred, an act so blatant and cruel it couldn't be ignored. A family had just installed a brand new swing set in their backyard for their kids. They returned home that evening and discovered a horrific scene. There were deep truck tire tracks running straight across the backyard, and the swing set was completely run over, crushed into scrap metal. No one saw the perpetrator, but the coincidence was zero. The large truck, belonging to the lawn-obsessed neighbor, had the exact tire tread to leave those marks. This wasn't an accident. This was the final message, a deliberate act of vandalism, a declaration that he could invade your property at any time, and nothing was off limits to his rage. At this point, we stopped just gossiping. We took action. The retired police officer neighbor, a man with experience, stepped up to lead. He was compiling all the testimonies from everyone in the neighborhood, from the crazy house-sitting list, to the wife's bruise, to the gun threat, and now the destroyed swing set. He was creating a chilling and comprehensive dossier. Why? Because the painful consensus of the entire neighborhood was, this is not going to end well. We weren't just dealing with an annoyance. We were dealing with an armed man with escalating violent tendencies and a fading grasp on reality. We kept this record not just to seek justice, but to ensure that when the worst happened, there would be enough evidence to hold him accountable. The entire neighborhood was living in fearful anticipation, knowing that the bang of the gun might just be the prelude to a much more tragic ending. You know, 2 years ago, when I decided to pack up my life and move to the UK for university, it wasn't just about getting a degree. For me, it was a desperate, almost primal need for escape. I had to get away from home. The situation there had just become so deeply, soul-crushingly toxic. It was the kind of environment that slowly suffocates you, and I needed an ocean between me and that chaos. My first year in the student halls was exactly what I needed: pure, unadulterated freedom. I met some absolutely fantastic people, started seeing a guy who is still my amazing boyfriend, and finally learned what it meant to stand on my own 2 feet. It was a golden, uncomplicated time, a real breath of fresh air. But like everything in life, that chapter closed. When second year rolled around, my friends and I decided to upgrade. We ditched the cramped, noisy dorms for a rented house, managed through the university accommodations. It felt like a massive win. We finally had our own space, less restriction on noise, and the freedom to feel like real adults. I snagged the ground floor room, a decision that, in hindsight, I can only describe as terrifyingly prophetic. My window looked out onto this tiny, little backyard. It was barely anything, just a small, concrete rectangle surrounded by high walls. But it was my spot. As a smoker, that yard became my daily sanctuary, my 5-minute break from studying. The critical, and frankly creepy, detail about this yard was the exit, an ancient, thin, wooden door. It led straight out to the alleyway, where everyone kept their bins. Seriously, it was so old and flimsy, I swear, you could probably shoulder charge it right off its hinges. To lock it, we had a pathetic mechanism. You could only secure it from the inside, and since the latch was basically useless, we had to rely on this janky system of tying thick strings through the handle and frame, knotting them tight for good measure. It was a barrier of string and hope, nothing more. We were totally boxed in by neighbors. On one side, quiet families. On the other, though, was a different kind of student house. And this is where the story gets really dark. Our right-hand neighbors were 5 guys. And I say guys, but they looked suspiciously too old to be students, easily in their mid-20s, with this strange, low-level menace hanging around them. They were shady, operating out of sight, and their house always had this unnerving energy. My first real taste of their world was absolutely shocking, a full-blown police intervention. Apparently, one of their flatmates had completely lost it, allegedly attacking the others with a kitchen knife and setting their kitchen on fire. I heard the frantic, desperate screams and rushed outside with my flatmates. We saw one of the guys standing there, just drenched in blood, deep cuts crisscrossing his arm, and a nasty gash bleeding on his head, all thanks to that knife. Driven by pure shock and adrenaline, we pulled him aside, offered him some first aid, and gave him an old shirt. While we were doing that, we watched the perp, the one who had turned their home into a bloodbath, being walked out by the police, cuffed, and loaded into a van. It was surreal. The police didn't tell us much, but the chaos spoke volumes. And the guy we helped? He was immediately weird. He wouldn't stop with the BS stories. Kept trying to inappropriately touch and flirt with me, even while he was bleeding. We also noticed the strong, unmistakable smell of marijuana clinging to him. We just wanted him safe, but the whole experience left a profoundly bad taste in my mouth. That initial moment of violence, of seeing a large knife involved, was my first loud warning sign that I was living next to something truly dangerous. After the whole knife and fire fiasco, I became seriously hypervigilant about the guy we'd helped. I wanted nothing to do with him, or any of his flatmates for that matter. I saw him around, walking to and from their perpetually dark, unsettling house, but I always managed to keep my distance. Silence was my best defense, my little shield against his weird intensity. But you know how it is when you're dealing with a predator. They don't respect boundaries. They just see them as challenges. That fragile peace shattered one afternoon. I had just popped out for a quick, routine trip to the corner shop. Nothing major, just a few minutes out. As I was walking back, he suddenly appeared, stepping right into my path. He started talking to me, but his conversation was completely off-kilter and weirdly aggressive. His eyes were intense, almost burning, and he was physically too close. It was textbook predatory behavior. Every single instinct I had was screaming danger. I couldn't even manage a polite, "Sorry, I'm busy." I just froze and didn't respond, hoping my silence would be the ultimate no. But he didn't take the hint. Instead, he just gave me this chilling, unnerving smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, in this unbelievably casual tone, "Oh, that's cool. If you don't want to talk now, I'll just wait right in front of your house then. We can catch up later." My heart absolutely plummeted. I was completely creeped out, past the point of being merely uncomfortable. This was no joke. This was a deliberate move to violate my sanctuary. I rushed out of the store, my adrenaline spiking, praying he was just messing with me. But as I turned onto my street, the fear became absolute horror. He was there, sitting right on my doorstep, and he'd brought company. One of his flatmates was settled next to him. They looked like they owned the place, lounging there, just waiting for me to show up. I hit the brakes instantly, retreating back down the street toward the shop, out of their line of sight. I was in full-blown panic mode. I grabbed my phone and called the only guy flatmate I had, practically begging him to go down, open the door, and tell these guys to get lost. But of course, luck was not on my side. He wasn't home, and neither was anyone else. I was trapped, locked out, with two unsettling, strange men sitting right in front of the door with the glass panel. They could practically see me if I got too close. The whole scene felt like a calculated power play. I was forced to literally wait them out. I hid for a miserable, anxiety-ridden hour until they finally, mercifully, got bored and walked off. The second they were gone, I sprinted, pure panic propelling me, back to the house, slamming and bolting that front door like my life depended on it. I tried to put it behind me, but the anxiety had set in deep. Then came the next unsettling clue. A few weeks later, I went out for a smoke in the backyard, and my blood ran cold. The wooden door to the alley, the one I always secured with that triple knotted string, was open. My stomach clenched, but the real punch came when I saw the string itself. It hadn't just come undone, it had been cleanly cut off. My mind immediately jumped to excuses. Must have been a flatmate taking out the trash, and they just forgot to retie it. But the truth was screaming louder. You don't forget to untie a knot by cutting it. Someone had deliberately breached our flimsy security. I quickly closed the door, replaced the string with an even thicker piece of rope, and tied it with a fisherman's knot. But the fear was there now, a physical presence. These guys weren't just weird and violent. They were testing the limits. They were looking for an opening. And they had just signaled that the game was officially on. We were basically living in a low-grade state of siege. The drug-dealing neighbors next door were a constant threat. And their house was a magnet for trouble. Their pattern became our nightmare soundtrack. Random nights of screaming, loud yelling, and violent-sounding fights that would tear through the thin walls and jar us awake. It was exhausting, living on that knife edge, but eventually, you just adapt. You learn to fall back asleep after the 5th time you hear furniture smashing. It's a horrible kind of coping mechanism. Then came that night. My boyfriend was staying over, like he usually did. Now, you have to understand, he is absolutely the deepest sleeper I have ever met. I'm talking about a man who could sleep through a hurricane with a smile on his face. But that night, in the intense, suffocating darkness of my ground floor room, he was the one who woke up first. Not me. I was dead to the world, protected by exhaustion. He was ripped out of sleep by 2 things. First, a loud, distinct bang, and then immediately following that, whispering, low, intense, and right outside our walls, the worst kind of sounds. He shook me very softly, a tiny, careful movement, and I woke up to the sheer, raw terror radiating off him. We didn't even have to talk. We were 2 statues in the pitch black, our hearts hammering, completely attuned to the absolute wrongness of the sounds coming from outside. The air in the room, already heavy, because I had the window open for air circulation, suddenly felt suffocatingly cold. Then it happened. The sound that made my blood turn to ice. We heard the wooden door to the backyard, the one I'd recently secured with that extra thick rope, just bang. It literally shot open. It was a violent, echoing sound of finality, like a barrier being ripped away. Right after, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching softly on the dirt and gravel, moving closer, and then stopping directly next to my window. We were inches away from them, separated only by glass and the thin fabric of my curtain. We froze, holding our breath, trying to be smaller than the space we occupied. I knew my window was slightly open at the top, just a little crack for air. Then, we heard them testing the house door, the one leading into the backyard from the kitchen, shaking it softly, trying to see if they could get in that way. They stopped, probably realizing it was double-locked. That's when the terror became personal. We heard the sound of my actual window moving, the frame creaking, the crack getting wider. They were trying to push it open further. And then, a voice. One of the guys said something in a different language that we couldn't place. It sounded harsh, commanding, and absolutely terrifying. Immediately, we started to hear them actively trying to climb in. This wasn't a casual peek. This was an attempt at forced entry. That was it, the absolute limit. We shot up out of the bed as one, adrenaline making us move faster than we thought possible. There was no time for shoes or anything unnecessary. I grabbed my phone, threw on the first bit of clothing I could find, and we ran out of that room, slamming the door behind us. We didn't stop in the house. We ran straight for the front door, through the living room, and bolted out of the house and into the street. We didn't know what they wanted, but the metallic smell of danger, carried by the massive knife we'd later learn about, was already hanging in the air. We were out, alive, and desperately hoping the police would get there before the whispers became screams. Running out onto the street in the middle of the night, barely clothed, and shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone, was the most terrifying moment of my life. My first thought wasn't even about us. It was about my flatmates. I called them, my voice shaking uncontrollably, screaming at them to lock themselves in their rooms. Then, I called the police. I remember telling the operator, "They're breaking in. They're in my yard. They're trying to get through the window." We were incredibly lucky. The local police station was just a couple of blocks away. Their sirens were a beautiful, terrifying sound, arriving in less than 5 minutes. The next hour is mostly a blur of blinding shock. My boyfriend and I were just huddled together, trying to piece together the reality of what had just happened. The police swarmed the scene. They were quick, professional, and efficient. They managed to catch one guy immediately. The other one, the weird, persistent one from the convenience store, had tried to bolt. But they found him a few streets over, smoking weed like he hadn't just tried to break into someone's home with violent intent. The audacity was simply staggering. But the real shock came when the officers gave us the report. They had searched the neighbor's house and found an arsenal of trouble, massive amounts of meth and heroin. These weren't just low-level dealers. They were running a serious operation right next door. And here's the detail that still keeps me up at night. The two guys they arrested, the two who were pushing my window open, were both carrying a huge kitchen knife. Not a little pocket knife, a full-on, massive weapon. I was completely dumbfounded. Why? What had we done? I hadn't seen anything, hadn't reported them. The thought of them standing inches from me, armed with a knife, ready to break in, with who knows what intentions, was absolutely sickening. The realization wasn't that they were thieves. It was that they were ready for violence. That idea terrorized my boyfriend and me down to our very core. We were seconds away from a potential home invasion turned violent crime. Eventually, the justice system did its thing. Both guys were arrested, and one was sentenced to 2 years in prison for carrying a weapon with the clear intention to harm. 2 years for what felt like a lifetime of terror for us. We never heard anything else from the police, and a chilling silence descended over the house. But the silence didn't bring peace. The incident tormented me for months. My mind was trapped in a perpetual loop of what if? What if my deep sleeping boyfriend hadn't woken up? What if I'd been home alone? That flimsy wooden door and the open window became symbols of my fragility. I couldn't stay there. A few months later, I moved back home, giving up my hard-won independence because the house felt poisoned. I'm still coping with the deep psychological scar this left. I wake up from the slightest noises now, and the horrible nightmares are a constant reminder. It's tough. It's a battle every single day. But hey, at least I'm still here, and I'm still with my boyfriend. We talk about it all the time, and that shared experience, that shared burden, truly helps me keep moving forward. We survived. You know, there are moments in your childhood, those sharp, defining memories, that stay perfectly preserved, kind of like a snapshot in amber. For me, that moment arrived right on the cusp of becoming a teenager. I was 11, almost 12, and my life was about to get a terrifying reality check. We lived in this tiny, old house that was poorly chopped up into apartments. Our place was the only one on the ground floor, and the problem wasn't the creaky floorboards, it was the tenant directly above us. She was, to put it bluntly, a coke dealer. And in a place with walls so thin, you could practically hear a whisper upstairs. That wasn't a secret. It was just the constant, nerve-wracking background noise of our lives. The air in our apartment always felt tense because of her. You'd hear the late-night traffic, the constant shuffling of strange people coming and going, a chaotic, unpredictable rhythm. But then, on the very night of my 12th birthday, the chaos stopped. She went missing. Not a polite. Moved out, vanishing. but a dead, immediate silence where the heavy footsteps used to be. It was the kind of sudden void that chills you to the bone, a silence that felt heavier, darker, than any noise she'd ever made. You just knew something bad had happened. A few days later, her boyfriend shows up. I recognized him, a guy with a sort of frantic, desperate energy about him. My mom, being the kind-hearted but maybe too trusting person she was, had allowed both of them to use our landline several times before. And back in 2004, having a cell phone was definitely the exception, not the rule. Especially in our neighborhood, the landline was our literal lifeline. I was home alone. Mom was at work just a 5-minute walk away. But 5 minutes might as well have been 500 miles when you're a kid. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, all hollowed out. He asked, just like it was a normal Tuesday, if he could use the phone. Since Mom had approved this before, I figured, no big deal. I let him in, a decision that still makes my stomach drop, and led him to the living room, which was right at the front of the apartment. I had no idea that by opening that door, I was inviting a fugitive right into my safe space. I moved away from the phone, giving him his privacy, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had coiled up in my gut the second he stepped inside. Being home alone always made me a little jumpy, but with him there, the silence in the apartment felt less empty and more loaded. I watched as he picked up the receiver, but his actions were immediately wrong. This wasn't a man trying to connect with someone. This was a man performing a check. He dialed a number, his eyes flickering toward the front window like he expected an ambush at any second. He waited, not for the usual 3 or 4 rings, but just a quick beat, long enough for the call to initiate, and then, without any conversation, he slammed the receiver back down. Click. The sound was sharp, final, and utterly suspicious. He did it again, dialed, waited, hung up. He repeated this bizarre, frantic ritual 3 times in total. I remember thinking, why is he doing that? Is he testing the line? Is he listening for a wire? It felt less like a desperate attempt to reach someone and more like a scared animal surveying its cage. His panic was a contagious thing. Every aborted call ratcheted up the tension in the room. He was trying to find out if he was safe, and clearly, he wasn't. By the 3rd hang-up, his energy was vibrating off him. He was breathing quickly, his large body shifting restlessly. He wasn't just nervous. He was utterly terrified, and he was infecting my space with his fear. I started inching backward, trying to melt into the shadows. A quiet, purely instinctual move for self-preservation. I knew with that absolute certainty kids sometimes have, that I needed to get away from him. But before I could even make it down the short hall, the silence was shattered by a sound that made my blood run instantly cold. The sound, when it came, wasn't muffled or gentle. It was the thud of the building's heavy, front security door being slammed open. In our tiny, echoey apartment, where the walls were barely thicker than cardboard, that sound wasn't just audible, it was intrusive. Someone had entered the building with force and absolute intent, and the boyfriend knew exactly what it meant. His transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment, he was pacing by the phone. The next, he was a statue carved out of pure dread. His eyes darted to the door, then locked onto mine. His hand shot up, his index finger pressing hard against his lips in a desperate, frantic shush. It wasn't a friendly gesture asking me to keep a secret. It was a desperate command from a man whose life had just flashed before his eyes. It was a silent, betraying plea. "Don't tell them I'm here. Don't tell anyone I was here," he mumbled, the words a strained, pathetic whisper. He didn't wait for my answer. He turned and executed the most desperate action I've ever witnessed. He fled. He wasn't running full out, but sort of speed walking, a low, urgent scramble down the long, narrow hall toward the absolute furthest point of our apartment, my bedroom. The gall of it, using a child's sanctuary as his last resort hiding spot. I was glued to the floor, watching my own bedroom door click shut. And then came the inevitable sound that confirmed his fear. It was a loud, sharp, three-part knock at our door, the kind of unmistakable, authoritative rhythm you only hear in movies or from the police. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered against my ribs. A desperate drum solo. My jaw dropped. I knew, with sickening certainty, who was standing on the other side of that flimsy wood. The nightmare had arrived. My entire body went rigid. Every cartoon, every crime show, every parental warning I'd ever absorbed flashed in my mind, but none of it prepared me for the actual heavy reality of that knock. I slowly, automatically, opened the door, and there he was, a police officer, tall, stern, and utterly composed, a stark contrast to the sweaty, frantic man hiding 30 feet away. The sight of the badge and the uniform had a paralyzing effect on my 11-year-old brain. I was too scared to lie, too young to think strategically. The cop didn't yell, he just asked, his voice calm but firm. "Is neighbor's boyfriend's name here?" The boyfriend's desperate shush from moments ago was completely eclipsed by the immediate, overwhelming authority standing on my doorstep. My mouth moved before my brain could stop it. I stammered out the worst possible answer, the words catching in my throat. "Yeah, he just went into my room." That moment of honest terror, that involuntary confession, was the final nail in the man's coffin. And it was me, the innocent kid, who hammered it in. The officer's face didn't change, but I saw a faint flicker of professional satisfaction in his eyes. He then asked, politely, almost casually, if he could step inside. What was I going to say? No, absolutely not. I felt a surge of adrenaline, coupled with a deep, sinking shame over betraying the man, even though he was a fugitive who had just invaded my privacy. But my need for protection was greater than any misguided loyalty. I nodded quickly, stepping aside. The officer crossed the threshold, and just like that, the safety of my home was compromised, no longer belonging entirely to me. The moment the first officer was inside, he executed his move, and it was chillingly brilliant. He didn't just rush down the hall, he leaned down, keeping his voice level, and asked me to perform a key task. "Can you let my partner in the back door and lead us both to your room?" It wasn't a question, it was a soft command, turning me into his unwitting guide. I was now actively involved, part of the operation to corner the suspect. We walked together toward the back of the apartment, the path immediately becoming a physical representation of my trapped state. Our apartment's layout was suddenly a maze designed for an ambush. We had to squeeze past the kitchen table, which sat in this narrow choke point between the back exit and the door to my bedroom. The space was incredibly tight. You had to turn sideways to get through. It felt like walking a gauntlet. I unlocked the back door, and his partner, a second officer, slipped in silently, confirming the tactical genius of the plan. I was wedged between two large, imposing men, guiding them straight toward the man who had ordered me to lie. The sickening realization dawned on me. I was an 11-year-old child leading a police raid on my own bedroom. They didn't need to search. They didn't need a map. They had me. We were standing right there, just inches from the last barrier, my bedroom door. There was no escape for the man inside, and I was the one who had inadvertently delivered him to the trap. I opened my bedroom door, my sanctuary, my private space, and the officers didn't hesitate. They didn't need to check under the bed or behind the curtains. They moved with the cold, practiced certainty of professionals who knew exactly where the rat would hide. They went straight for the closet. It was an old, deep closet, the one where I kept my jackets and my secret childhood treasures. The visual shock when they threw the door open was immediate and deeply violating. There he was, the neighbor's boyfriend, huddled and contorted, his large body crammed into the tiny space. He looked defeated, terrified, and utterly pathetic. He had chosen the most innocent place in the house to try and disappear, using my childhood as his shield. The officers didn't waste a second on conversation. There was no sound more final than that metallic click. It was the sound of justice. Yes, but for me, it was the sound of a terrifying chapter closing. I stayed absolutely motionless in the living room, listening to the heavy engine noise of the police car driving away, the ultimate confirmation that the danger was gone, at least for now. The instant the silence settled back into the apartment, the shock wore off, and a tidal wave of pure, white-hot adrenaline and fear hit me. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys, moving with a desperate, frantic energy, triple-checking that both the back and front doors were locked and secured. I fled, slamming the front door behind me. My mom's workplace was typically a 5-minute walk, a pleasant stroll. But I wasn't walking. I was running like my life depended on it. I've never been a fast runner, but fueled by terror. I genuinely believe I cut that trip down to barely 2 minutes. My lungs burned, tears streamed down my face, and all I could articulate was the one primal need. I just wanted my mom. When I burst into her workplace, sobbing uncontrollably, she took one look at my face and knew everything was wrong. After I managed to choke out the story, the calls, the shush, the closet, the handcuffs, my mother's concern instantly morphed into incandescent fury. She was livid, not at me, but at the sheer, disgusting audacity of that man, hiding in a child's closet, using me as an unwitting, disposable shield against the police. That night, she gave me a gentle but firm lecture, a new, ironclad rule about never letting anyone inside unless she was home. But the rules couldn't erase the terrifying truth. To this day, the whole event is a dark smudge on my memory. I never found out exactly what he was wanted for. More importantly, I never found out what really happened to the coke dealer who vanished on my birthday. I don't want to know. But the chilling question of what he intended to do if the cops hadn't knocked that day, that is the terrifying ghost that still haunts the corners of my mind.